Every Rolls-Royce built this year was sold before the paint even finished curing. The order book runs more than a year deep in most markets around the world. Ask the people who actually run the company, and they will tell you plainly on the record that they could sell 2 or 3 times what they currently build and never once run out of buyers willing to pay. In 2023, Rolls-Royce delivered 6,032 cars, the best year in its 119-year history. That same year, the company's own leadership publicly admitted they had no interest in chasing a bigger number the year after. Then they proved it. Not because they couldn't build more, because they wouldn't. Somewhere between a hotel lobby in Manchester and a showroom in Dubai, saying no to growth became the entire business model. So how does a car company end up treating its own success like a threat? To answer that, you have to go back to the 2 men who built this company on a premise that had nothing to do with volume in the first place. Henry Royce was a self-taught engineer running a small electrical business out of Manchester, and he was obsessive, almost to the point of exhaustion, about mechanical perfection. In 1904, he built himself a car, a 2-cylinder machine called the Royce 10, mostly because he couldn't find one on the market that met his own standard. Charles Rolls was the opposite kind of man entirely. The aristocratic son of Lord and Lady Langattock, educated at Eton, already running a London dealership that imported the finest cars in Europe. On May 4th, 1904, a mutual friend introduced the 2 of them at the Midland Hotel in Manchester. Rolls took the Royce 10 out for a drive. Within minutes he agreed to sell every single car Royce could build, under one condition: it would carry both their names. The 2 men settled on a small specific lineup: a 2-cylinder, a 3-cylinder, a 4-cylinder, and a 6-cylinder model, and agreed that Rolls alone would handle the selling while Royce alone handled the building. Even at the very start, there was no ambition here to flood the market. There was only ambition to never be beaten on quality. The company that formed 2 years later needed a 3rd man to actually make it famous. Claude Johnson, Rolls's business partner, took over marketing with such skill that he earned the nickname the hyphen in Rolls-Royce. It was Johnson who coined the phrase that would define the brand for the next century: the best car in the world. In 1907, the Silver Ghost backed that claim up, completing a 15,000-mile endurance run with almost no mechanical faults, a result that stunned the motoring press of the day. From day one, Rolls-Royce was never really selling transportation. It was selling proof that something could be built without a single compromise. That idea would outlive both founders by more than 100 years, and it would eventually cost the company more money than either of them ever imagined. For most of the 20th century, that idea nearly killed the company outright. Nationalisation in the 1970s, a messy split between the aero-engine business and the car business, decades of ownership changes and underinvestment left Rolls-Royce a shadow of its founding ambition. The real turning point came in 1998, when then-owner Vickers put the company up for sale and triggered a bidding war between BMW and Volkswagen. The settlement split the 2 most famous names in British luxury motoring apart for good. Volkswagen walked away with the Bentley name and the historic Crewe factory. BMW walked away with something smaller but ultimately far more valuable: the rights to the words Rolls-Royce and the flying lady on the hood. On January 1st, 2003, at the stroke of midnight, the first Goodwood-built Phantom was handed to its new owner, and Rolls-Royce Motor Cars, as the world knows it today, was officially born. What happened over the next 2 decades was one of the great brand turnarounds in modern business history. Torsten Müller-Ütvös took over as CEO in 2010, when the company was selling roughly 1,000 cars a year to a customer base whose average age was 56. Over the next 14 years, he rebuilt the brand from the ground up, adding the Ghost, the Wraith, the Cullinan, and the Dawn, and leaning hard into edgier design language with the Black Badge program. By 2022, annual deliveries had climbed 6-fold to more than 6,000 cars, a record at the time. The average buyer's age fell to 43. 1 in 5 buyers was a celebrity. Average transaction prices doubled, from roughly $250,000 to $500,000 a car. In 2023, Rolls-Royce posted the best sales year in its entire history. By every normal business metric, this was a company that should have been racing to build a second factory. Instead, The man running it had already told anyone who would listen that he had no intention of doing that at all. If you're the kind of person who likes watching a business make a decision that looks completely insane on paper and turns out to be genius, subscribe now, because this whole channel is built on stories exactly like this one. Here's the part that separates Rolls-Royce from almost every other manufacturer on Earth. This wasn't caution, and it wasn't a supply problem. It was a deliberate, repeated, on-the-record refusal to chase money that was sitting right in front of them. "We're always producing one car less than we can sell," Miller at first said at the height of his tenure. "It's easy to produce more, but that would be completely against the Rolls essence." He turned down demands from his own dealers for extra inventory. He refused to build a car priced below the Ghost, even though a cheaper model would have unlocked a dramatically larger customer base overnight. "Nobody needs a Rolls-Royce," he said, and he meant it as a strategy, not an insult. The company backed this philosophy with actual teeth. When it launched the $425,000 Spectre, its first electric model, Rolls-Royce announced that anyone caught flipping the car for a quick profit would be placed on a permanent blacklist, banned for life from ever buying another Rolls-Royce again from any dealer in the network. It didn't fully work. One reseller told a British trade publication he had already lined up 2 pre-buyers willing to pay a $65,000 premium over sticker just to jump the queue. John Colbeth, president of Rolls-Royce North America, later called the industry's obsession with volume a race to the bottom that puts a brand's entire image at risk. No celebrity endorsement deals either. The company's position was that the car had to speak for itself. Every one of these choices left real revenue on the table. Every one of them was made anyway, on purpose, by people who understood exactly what they were giving up. It was sold to the world as restraint. It was actually the most calculated pricing strategy in the entire luxury auto industry. But a strategy built entirely on scarcity carries a hidden cost, and by the middle of this decade, it was starting to show. Look closely at where Rolls-Royce's growth was actually coming from, and the picture gets uncomfortable fast. Over a recent 5-year stretch, total company deliveries grew by just 78 units. Deliveries of one single model, the Cullinan SUV, grew by 869 units in that same window. Do the math on the rest of the lineup. The sedans and coupes that built the brand's original reputation actually shrank by 791 units combined. By 2025, the Cullinan alone accounted for 58% of everything Rolls-Royce sold worldwide, up sharply from a much smaller share just a few years earlier. The Cullinan itself had only existed since 2018, Rolls-Royce's first ever SUV, a car the brand resisted building for years out of fear it would cheapen the Marque's sedan and coupe heritage. Instead, it became the thing that quietly kept the entire company's growth story alive almost single-handedly. A company that had spent 120 years refusing to be defined by any single product had quietly become dependent on one. And there was a nearby warning about exactly how that story tends to end. Bentley, Rolls-Royce's old sibling brand, now under Volkswagen ownership, rode its own Bentayga SUV to record results earlier this decade, then watched operating profit collapse by 63% over just 2 years as Bentayga volume fell from 5,940 units down to 3,640. Rolls-Royce had built its entire business model around never chasing growth. It just hadn't noticed that growth had started chasing it back. Through the one door in the lineup it couldn't fully control. No second SUV to fall back on. No cheaper model to cushion a downturn. No way to walk back a promise about scarcity once the whole company was leaning on one silhouette. The first real pressure came from outside the company entirely. Rolls-Royce had publicly pledged to go fully electric by 2030, and its first battery-powered model, the Spectre, launched in late 2023 to enormous fanfare. Early demand was so intense that Rolls-Royce had to threaten lifetime bans just to keep speculators from flipping it before delivery. But enormous fanfare is not the same thing as sustained demand. As broader enthusiasm for EVs cooled sharply among ultra-wealthy buyers who prized the theatre of a V12 engine as much as the badge on the hood, Spectre sales collapsed by 47% in 2025 alone, a number nobody at Goodwood had modelled for. Rolls-Royce wasn't the only ultra-luxury brand caught in this reversal. Lamborghini quietly axed further development of its own electric crossover. Aston Martin delayed its EFIA rollout entirely, pushing the timeline back by years. The macro story here wasn't really a Rolls-Royce problem. It was an industry-wide miscalculation about how fast the world's richest customers would actually walk away from internal combustion, and Rolls-Royce got caught holding a headline pledge it could no longer comfortably keep. Then came a second complication, this one geopolitical rather than technological. New tariffs on UK-built vehicles entering the United States, Rolls-Royce's single largest market at roughly a third of all global sales, threatened to squeeze margins on a product line that had never once had to compete on price before. It wasn't the first time global turmoil had tested the brand. During the 2009 financial crisis, Rolls-Royce deliveries fell 17% while General Motors, Ford and Chrysler each saw sales crater by 30% or more. The ultra-wealthy had always been the most insulated customers in the entire auto industry. This time, the pressure wasn't coming from their bank accounts. It was coming from Washington and from their own shifting taste in engines. Internally, the pressure looked different but cut just as deep. Müller-Oeth first stepped down on November 30th, 2023, handing the company to Chris Brownridge, a career BMW executive with almost 3 decades inside the parent company's sales and marketing operation, most recently running BMW's entire UK business. It was a graceful transition on paper. In practice, it meant the brand's most stubbornly independent philosophy now had to be defended by someone who came up inside a corporate parent that sells more than 2 million BMW badged cars a year alone, and answers to shareholders who understand growth in exactly one direction: up. Brownridge inherited a factory running close to its own physical limit, producing roughly 28 cars a day, with a workforce that had grown from 300 to 2,500 people since 2003. When the company announced upgrades to its paint shop in May 2024, Brownridge himself admitted the investment was needed to relieve bottlenecks in the current production process. The refusal to scale wasn't just a marketing position anymore. It had become an actual physical constraint, baked into a building that hadn't fundamentally changed since it opened. And yet, despite everything, Goodwood still carried the highest profit margins of any brand inside the entire BMW group, higher than BMW itself and higher than Mini. Every single car that rolled off that constrained production line mattered more to the parent company's bottom line than almost anything else it built. As 2024 came to a close, the number that had climbed for nearly a decade and a half without a single interruption finally did something it hadn't done since the last global financial crisis. It went down. If a business betting everything on scarcity while it quietly hits a physical ceiling sounds like the kind of story you want more of, that's this channel every week. Subscribe and stick around for what happened next. On the surface, 2024 still looked like a success story. Rolls-Royce delivered 5,712 cars, the third best year in its history. But it was also a 5% drop from the 6,032 unit record set the year before, and the company itself pinned the dip on model changeovers for the Ghost and Cullinan. Then, in 2025, deliveries fell again, down another 0.8% to 5,664 units. 2 consecutive annual declines, back to back, for a company that had spent almost the entire Müller-Oeth era moving in exactly one direction. It was the first time Rolls-Royce had posted back-to-back annual drops since the depths of the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, a comparison nobody at Goodwood was eager to make out loud. Underneath that modest overall dip sat the real shock, the biggest single number in this entire story. Cullinan deliveries rose 27.1% to 3,291 units in 2025 alone, meaning the SUV now made up well over half of every car the company sold worldwide. Meanwhile, the Phantom, the actual flagship, the car that had defined the marque's reputation for a century and was celebrating its own centenary that same year, sat dead last on the sales chart, starting at nearly $600,000 and finding fewer buyers than the discontinued Wraith and Dawn combined. The math had become impossible to ignore. A company built to prove it never needed volume had ended up relying on a single vehicle for nearly 60% of its entire business. The scarcity strategy hadn't failed. But it had narrowed to a point that made the whole enterprise far more fragile than anyone at Goodwood had ever been willing to admit publicly. Rolls-Royce's answer to 2 years of shrinking volume was not to build more cars. It was to make the cars it already built worth dramatically more, to almost nobody's surprise given everything that came before. In January 2025, the company announced an investment exceeding £300 million, roughly $376 million, into expanding the Goodwood plant, the single largest capital injection since the factory first opened in 2003. The money wasn't going toward a second production line. Almost none of it was. It was going toward the Bespoke and coach build divisions, the invitation-only arm of the company where clients pay staggering premiums to design one-off details no other car on the planet will ever carry. The bet was already paying dividends before the ground was even broken. Consider the boat tail, a coach-built commission limited to just 3 examples, each one reportedly priced around $28 million, making it the most expensive new car sold anywhere in the world. Rolls-Royce didn't need to sell thousands of those to move the needle. It needed to sell 3. Bespoke content value per car rose 10% year over year in 2024 alone. The company's coach build program, responsible for the swept tail, the boat tail, and the gold-embellished Phantom nicknamed Goldfinger, had quietly turned individual one-off commissions into the most profitable corner of the entire business. Rolls-Royce expanded its invitation-only private office network to New York and Seoul that same year, joining existing outposts in Dubai and Shanghai, while membership in its exclusive client app, Whispers, climbed 55% in a single year. The logic behind all of it was simple, and in its own way, fairly ruthless. If the number of cars couldn't grow without breaking the brand that built them, the price attached to each car could. Today, Rolls-Royce is still turning away buyers on purpose. The order book still runs more than a year long in most regions of the world. The company that could sell 2 or 3 times its current volume in a single season still refuses to try, but the ground underneath that confidence has shifted more in the last 2 years than in the previous decade combined. Growth now depends almost entirely on one SUV. The electric future the company staked its 2030 pledge on has slowed down instead of speeding up. Tariffs threaten its biggest single market, and a factory built for a smaller, gentler era of demand is straining at its own seams for the first time in 20 years. Who knows exactly where Rolls-Royce will stand by the time this video reaches you, given how quickly all 3 of those pressures are still moving. But the lesson underneath this story isn't really about cars, and it never was. In a global economy engineered to manufacture absolutely everything at scale, the one asset nobody has figured out how to mass produce is scarcity itself. Rolls-Royce understood that before almost anyone else in the industry did, and built a 100-year business on refusing to break it, even when breaking it would have made them richer, faster, sooner. The company's own engineers have a word for the sensation their cars are famous for: waftability, the feeling of being carried rather than driven. It turns out the same principle applies to the business itself. Rolls-Royce never needed to race anyone to the top. It just needed to stand still long enough for everyone else to keep racing past it.